Welcome everyone to Women Refugee Commission. This is our press and policy briefing. We are here with Zain Lakhani, who is the director of our Migrant Rights and Justice Program. And we're here to share with you some analysis that Zain and our team here have done, as well as partners of ours who are out in different parts of the world. And we're responding to a very significant week with Supreme Court rulings, most recently affirming birthright citizenship, but also rulings that deal with temporary protected status and with asylum. Women's Refugee Commission for 36 years has been focused on women refugees and women migrants, first listening and then also amplifying the experiences, the solutions, and the research of women on the front lines to move forward policies that better lives for whole communities. That's the focus of our talk today, the impact on women and their families of these very consequential rulings. A few housekeeping notes. Thank you all very much for joining us. We know you're working on these issues, you're reporting on these issues, and you're moving forward change. We consider you a very vital part of our community. We want to hear from you today. We've got a very active Q&A. Please make your comments in the Q&A section. I'll be monitoring them as we go, so I'll try to pepper those in. Hold on just a moment. As you can hear, we do have Spanish translation available. Sorry, I need to get one moment. Okay, so we do have Spanish translation available. Sorry, just
Apologies, all to our for our tech
okay, we're
hiccups
back.
here. Great.
A couple other things. This is on the record. Also, we're very much available to you. If we don't get to your questions today, you can contact us directly. Zain is available for briefings, but also we want to connect you with our partners in various countries who can speak on these issues as well. So we are here for you. Zain, we're going to move right into the top part of this, which we're going to hear from you on these three cases. Then we're going to go to Q&A. So let us start with birthright citizenship, this very consequential ruling by a narrow margin that affirms birthright citizenship. But you have shared with me from your research that there are several ways in which U.S. citizen children who are born to immigrant parents face barriers to experience full citizenship with access to services, access to guardianship.
That's exactly right, Xanthe. Thank you. And just from my own, side of the house, a welcome to everyone who's
Zain,
here.
I
Thank you
can't hear
so
you.
much
Are
for
you on mute?
joining us. Oh, can you not hear me? Sorry, can I get a quick, I'm off mute,
Okay,
so
can panelists hear Zain?
panelists can hear me? Okay.
Okay.
Maybe I'll begin and answer, and we'll try and work things out on Xanthe's end. So I'll just go back. A welcome to everybody. Very, very glad that you were here to join us for this important event. So to respond to your first question, Xanthe, yes. So we did get a decision in Trump versus Barbara, the birthright citizenship case yesterday, and it was indeed a victory by a narrow margin, but it was indeed a victory, and it affirms what the Constitution says in very plain terms, that all children born in the United States are equal, full and equal citizens. And I think it's really important to recognize that citizenship in the United States is a one size fits all category, right? Everybody has the same rights and privileges before the law. But as you note, what WRC has been tracking and seeing very closely, watching very closely over the past year and a half is that functionally, both in the law and in practice, the 6 million US citizen children who are born to at least one undocumented parent are not experiencing or able to access equal citizenship rights in the same way as their classmates and friends sitting next to them in school who have two US citizen parents. So I want to start by giving you an example of how this is kind of written into benefits in the law. I think one very clear example of this is the child tax credit. So the child tax credit is one of the most successful anti-poverty programs of the past 40 years. It gives qualifying families the right or some basic funds to, keep food on the table, keep a roof overhead, basically meet essential services for families whose income levels qualify. Last year in HR1, also known as the One Big Beautiful Bill, the eligibility restrictions for the child tax credit changed. So now, if you are a qualifying U.S. citizen child, but one of your parents is undocumented, you are no longer eligible for the child tax credit. But your neighbor, who is also income eligible and otherwise eligible, but has two U.S. citizen parents, is, right? So this is a way in which you do not get those vital, life-sustaining benefits to which you are entitled to as a U.S. citizen because one of your parents is an immigrant. So that's one really clear way in which we can see that inequality sort of showing up in the law. And there are other ways, right? There are regulations that would limit access to public housing for parents, for mixed status families where one parent is undocumented and one parent is a citizen. There's many, many others, access to food stamps and other benefits, right? So the child tax credit is one, but it is by no means the only example of how this is showing up in the law.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Zain. Can you talk a little bit about guardianship issues as well?
Absolutely. So another core issue that we've been tracing, and WRC has done extensive work on this. You'll see in the chat, many of you are probably already familiar with our work on family separation, really documenting and tracking how parents are being deported without being given an opportunity to make arrangements for their children, either to bring their children with them when they are removed or make arrangements for them to live safely with a legal guardian of their choice in the United States, right? So US policy requires that they have an opportunity to be able to do this. And we have been tracking parents or seeing that parents are being deported without being given this chance. And I want to take a step back and focus on what happens to the children who are left in this situation. So their parents are deported sometimes very quickly, right? Their mother dropped them to school, was arrested on the way back from dropping them to school, was put into detention, was hopscotched around to 4 or 5 detention facilities and deported to Honduras 5 days later without being given a chance to make whoever is going to care for them a legal guardian, say their sister or a sibling or anyone else who they are being cared for. So they're in informal care, right? The person who's caring for them does not have the ability to enroll them in school, to take them to a hospital, to get them access to health care. If they are eligible as a U.S. citizen for CHIP or TANF or any of the other, state benefits that they may urgently require, there is nobody who has the legal right to secure that, to get them a passport so they can go rejoin their mother in Honduras or wherever it is that, their mother's country of origin is, right? So these children, they have legal rights as citizens, right, to all of these benefits, but they are not able to access them because their parent was deported without being able to assign them a legal guardian. So that's kind of another way in which we are seeing functionally, really large numbers of children. We don't know how many, but we know it's a really significant number who are being left in this kind of informal care in ways that just prevent them from accessing those rights that they have.
Thank you, Zain. So I just want to take a moment to talk to the audience to say we do want your questions. That was a lot of information, so do feel free to send them in, and we'll take them on this point now if they're coming in. And we're also sharing some resources as we go in the chat, so feel free to look for those. But Zain, for the sake of our audience, because we are the Women's Refugee Commission, we are advocating for all women refugees and migrants and their families, but today we're really talking about U.S. citizen children born to non-citizens. And just for a moment, why do you focus on U.S. citizens in this conversation so much? What is the reason why you have kind of circumscribed what we're talking about to U.S. citizen children?
So the Women's Refugee Commission works on both U.S. citizen children and non-U.S. citizen children, right? We believe that rights and privileges are equally deserved by both, and we have supported both populations equally. I think the reason that we're really focusing on U.S. citizen children in the context of this particular conversation is because it's under the auspices or related to the birthright citizenship decision, right? But it's a really, really great question because it should absolutely not be mistaken for a disproportionate focus on U.S. citizen children in our work. It's just that I'm highlighting that because we're talking about the U.S. citizenship decision today.
Right. We're talking about this is the world that we're in with the U.S. policies and rulings that we have. And within that framework, there are some inconsistencies that are really important to point out and that need to be dealt with, and for which you are advancing solutions actively. So we're going to hear more about that. And Zain, I do want to pull up, you talked about this gray space that's happening in an environment of fear. It's happening in an environment of deportation. And so families are doing the best that they can to provide care for their children, but not necessarily in a place where they can access the kind of legal process that would lead to guardianship for that child. The other thing that I've heard you talk about is registration for birth certificates, which
Mhm.
I know we don't have data about how extensive this issue is, but from a logical perspective, it seems like this could be a serious issue with immigrant, undocumented women giving birth. How are they going to access birth certificates for their US born citizen children?
Yeah, absolutely. And, for those of you familiar with the broader work that the Women's Refugee Commission does on pregnant, postpartum, and nursing women, both in immigration custody and in the community more broadly, we'll sort of hear some of the echoes of what Xanthe is saying, right? This is something that an issue that we are very closely attuned to. And in the interest of time, I will invite all of you to stay tuned. Next week, we're going to put out, a briefing document that talks about how this issue is showing up with respect to pregnant women, including in these custodial settings like ICE detention or our custody. So stay tuned next week. We'll get you more information on how to think about that vital issue.
Right. And that builds on work that you have done, Zain, in partnership with Physicians for Human Rights out of Honduras, where you've talked with women who have been deported and have been able to show the ways in which what's happening in practice as far as the detention of parents who, under US policy, should have the right to secure their children if they're being detained and to reunite with their children or have the option to be reunited with their children if they're being deported. So please also look for that research and forthcoming research on that topic as well.
Yep,
So
absolutely.
we are going to talk about asylum now. So talk about the ruling on asylum, Zain, huge implications going forward. And of course, as Women's Refugee Commission, it's our mandate to point out the specific gender-based implications of the ruling that came out this past week.
Great, thank you. Important shift. So, one very quick thing that I want to flag at the top with respect to the asylum decision, it is very important to note that the decision itself does not create a policy. So, no new policy has been created by this decision. What it does is it gives this or any future administration the ability to create a policy that limits or restricts when somebody can seek asylum at a port of entry at the southern border, right? And I think what is, these are called metering policies. It's not that important to get into the technical details, but essentially what they are saying is, an administration can limit how many people can cross the border at a given time. It could say, no more than 1,000 people a week. It could say no more people when 500 people have crossed. And because this decision does not place any guardrails on what a metering policy could look like, it could even allow an administration or give an administration license to say, hey, we're not going to let anybody in, right? Because of the way the decision is structured and kind of how it interprets the law. And I'm happy to follow up a little more on that if someone wants to understand the nitty-gritty of how that works. So this has really, really huge impacts for women and girls fleeing violence and seeking safety. And I want to talk about two in particular. The first is that there is the possibility that this or a future administration could functionally end access to asylum at ports of entry at the southern border. And asylum is a legal right for people. We have a very stringent adjudication process, but people do have a legal right to seek asylum, and it is an urgently needed protection. There is a reason why we have both US law and global international UN conventions that talk about why this is so important for people to be able to do, right? And for women, especially fleeing gender-based persecution, fleeing gang violence, fleeing all other forms of gender-based violence and sexual violence that they experience, asylum is a critical and sometimes life-saving form of protection. And so if we are essentially cutting off access to asylum in the United States for these women, we are keeping them in very dangerous situations, right? And giving them no opportunity for escape, or really limiting their opportunities for escape. So that is one very significant, harm that I want to identify. This second actually comes from the shape of the policy itself and essentially what it is allowing to do, which is create this like restrictive or metering policy that says, okay, if you show up at the port of entry and you want to seek asylum, they might say, no, you have to wait. You could have to wait months, you could have to wait years, right, for your ability to make your claim and go through our very rigorous adjudication process. And we have had some policies in the past that create that do this, that duplicate, that either meter or kind of restrict when people can get in. One example is Title 42, which we saw during COVID-19, right, which basically said nobody could enter. So people were forced to kind of stack up or camp along the border, waiting for their opportunity to be able to seek asylum in the United States. The same during the first Trump administration, we had what was called the Remain in Mexico policy, which did a very similar thing, right? It forced people to kind of camp along the border, waiting for their opportunity. And because they are waiting in line for a specific chance, they can't leave, right? This is not somewhere where they can kind of go. They are basically stuck there, waiting for their chance. And they're doing so without really any legal rights, right? They don't have the legal right to work. They don't have the legal right to rent an apartment, right? They're really stuck in these really highly vulnerable settings. And we know from both of those past experiences how dangerous that was for women and girls. And WRC did a lot of work in both of those contexts, working with women and girls who were stuck waiting along the border. We knew that the rates of sexual violence were extreme, right? That women were highly, highly vulnerable to violence from the cartels, for exploitation, sorry, what are words today? Exploitation, human trafficking. And because they were stuck there, they were also sitting ducks, essentially for anyone who was persecuting them, be it a gang or be it an abusive spouse, to find them. And I want to be clear, these are not abstract things that might happen. These are things we saw in practice. We saw that it was an extraordinarily dangerous situation for women when they have been forced to camp along the border this way. We have two very concrete examples of exactly how this played out, and we know that it is very dangerous. So an unregulated metering policy that is not very carefully attuned to these kinds of safety concerns is going to put women right back into that dangerous situation all over again.
Thank you, Zain. So, and I think this makes me think about the various people in our audience and who are on the call with us today. We had about 80 people register in the past 12 hours for this conversation. Some are coming from the activist community around the world, refugee women leaders and those that work closely with migrant and refugee women. And we also have some journalists and policymakers on the line. And from a journalism perspective, the importance of tracking these issues and making our policymakers accountable to the real life implications of these very messy policies, these policies that have not always been thought all the way through, regardless of what the decision is, but that there is then a fallout. And so I'm grateful for our reporters on the line who are really keeping an eye on these issues, and very happy to stay in contact to be a source point where we see these issues as they erupt. So Zain, we've got a question coming in. What should Congress or advocates do before any new metering policy of that type is announced?
Such a great question. I'm really glad to respond to that, and thank you to whoever asked it. So we urgently need Congress to step in and provide limits and protections around what any metering policy could look like. And that needs to ensure several fundamental things. Basically, at the most base level, it needs to ensure that there is still access to asylum at ports of entry at the southern border, right? We need to make sure that the will of Congress in the 1980 refugee law that creates a legal right to seek asylum is still real, right? So that any metering policy that is imposed does not take away that fundamental right and force women and girls and many others back into situations of danger by essentially taking away that right. So we need to make sure that Congress passes legislation that imposes guardrails, safe, fair guardrails. And that also that those guardrails are attuned to some of the safety concerns that I just mentioned, right? That they aren't creating or recreating some of the damage and the harms you've seen in the past, that they are fair, that they are equitable, that they're deeply attuned to the safety needs of vulnerable populations like women and girls. So that is what Congress can do before any metering policy goes into place. And we urgently need them to do that. And we are working very closely with members of Congress on these issues.
Thank you. And just to say that these are not, pie in the sky suggestions in terms of policy, but rather very active work that WRC and Coalition and other partners are doing with members of Congress to advance solutions. So I appreciate the question. More deep, we can provide more detail into the specifics of that on follow-up. I've got a question from Rebecca Santana at the AP. Thank you, Rebecca. She says, I have heard a lot of commentary about how the green card case that SCOTUS decided about the case of Muk Choi Liu is nuanced and would like to know about wider repercussions. And she says it's nuanced and possibly does not have wider repercussions. Is that accurate, or could the administration use this decision to target the rights of green card holders in other ways?
Rebecca, that is an incredibly complicated and deeply important question. And if possible, I would love to ask if you can just reach out to me separately, and I'd love to go into this in detail with you, if that would be okay.
Okay. Question. I think that this question goes back a little bit to the research that we talked about in Honduras, Zain. So to the extent that you can draw on that and maybe bring it back into our conversation today. Question from the audience. Can you tell us a little bit more about the conditions on the ground for women and girls? Sorry, this question is about the condition for women and girls on the border. So with regard to the asylum case, are there women and girls at the border? What is the status today?
So at this moment, we are not seeing a lot of people stacked up along the border or trying to seek asylum at ports of entry, right? Or along the southern border at all. And that comes, and I think that's deeply problematic, but that comes from, since the start of the Trump administration with the border being effectively quote unquote closed. And I know you will be familiar with a lot of the language that the administration uses around having closed the border. But essentially, no, right now, nobody is able to seek asylum at the southern border. So, this is something that a future administration, this administration could impose, and that would kind of codify a lot of in policy, something that we're already seeing functionally happening in practice. A future administration that does reopen the legal right to seek asylum at the southern border would have the right then to sort of actually also kind of close it or meter it, right? But right now, this is not something that has consequences right now for people at the border, because people are just not seeking asylum at the southern border right now because of the broader political context that we are in.
Right. So this is one to watch in a way as far as the physical dangers that can occur as a result of how this policy opens things up. We've got a follow-up question there. Does this decision incentivize asylum seekers to not enter the U.S. through ports of entry? And what are the implications of that?
I mean, that is a very, very valid point, right? We want people to enter at ports of entry. What we want is for people to go up to a port of entry and say, I'm an asylum seeker. They can, sort of get in line, do their process, right? Go through the process the way it is intended. That is a way that we would like to incentivize, as opposed to kind of forcing people, if they need to urgently seek this protection, to try to cross the border illegally and then seek asylum once they are already in the United States. And that is a real risk of this decision, right? Is that you're taking away, that kind of orderly, fair port of entry process, and you're incentivizing people to flee danger in much more, more in the shadows, which is dangerous for everybody. Yeah.
Right. And that's, I think that's a theme that we're coming back to, which is gray spaces. So if you take away the more orderly option, then you're left, because we know what the conditions are that people are fleeing, and we know that people do flee as an act of desperation. And so this creates more space, which creates more danger. And we know in particular for the population that we serve, that this creates incredible danger, physical, psychological, and otherwise, for women and their families. So we are moving into a very different way of operating. And I think that's why I'm really glad that we have this community who is watching these issues, so that we can see what this fallout looks like, and bring attention and bring accountability to it, because more policy making will need to be done. And you talked about the broader legal framework in the U.S., and I think it's also worth noting that this is the 75th anniversary of the 1951 Refugee Convention. So that's in the international arena. But we do still live in a world where we have international and U.S. law that protects refugees and asylum seekers. So we can take more questions on this, but I also want to move into talking about temporary protected status and the ruling that came out this past week. Zain, can you talk about that with the impact for Haitian and Syrian women in particular, but also the broader population of individuals that have had or still have temporary protected status in the United States?
Absolutely. And just to tie it back to what you just said, Xanthe, about the 75th, anniversary, this is another decision that really strikes at the heart of humanitarian protections that we have under law for people who are facing grave violence and harm, right? So this is another decision that really, really strikes at the heart of what it is that those conventions and that our US laws, the refugee law, the law creating temporary protected status, are really intended to do. And, kind of that this is happening in the year of the 75th anniversary, I think is just really, it really kind of highlights the stakes, and sort of shows why the work that we are doing, is so important across the community, right? With our partners across the advocacy community, why continuing to work urgently to protect the rights of migrant and displaced women, girls, and families, and more broadly, is so, so urgent. So to talk specifically about temporary protected status, just to give a tiny bit of a primer for anyone who isn't familiar, temporary protected status is basically a form of legal status that says anyone who is present in the United States from a country, that the US decides is too dangerous to go back to, can stay here and live and work legally until the US determines that it is safe for them to return. And usually this is because of a natural disaster or the outbreak of a conflict or some other emergency situation, right? We actually see all three happening in Haiti and Syria, right? Both conflict and emergency situation and a national disaster. TPS was designated for Haiti after the 2010 earthquake. Again, I'm sorry, I'm tripping over my words here.
Talk about today.
Yeah, yeah. So, we kind of see all three showing up in these two countries. And going into the second Trump administration, so on January 20th, 2025, there were 17 countries that had been designated for TPS protections, protecting about 1.3 million people, right? So that's just to give you kind of a base level. And it's really critical to note, I think this was implied in what I said, but I just want to pull out, temporary protected status is not supposed to be rescinded until the US government determines that it is safe, the country is safe to return to. And we see here with Haiti and Syria, the State Department has issued a level 4 travel advisory, which is the highest and most dangerous advisory, do not enter for fear of life-threatening harm. So we know that the US government has determined that these countries are dangerous, right? Are too dangerous to return to. And so that is just kind of some backdrop, I think, of TPS and kind of how it works. So what this decision does is it clears the way for the US government to rescind TPS for Haiti and Syria. The decision itself does not actually do that. That's, kind of an important an important distinction, but it clears the way for the US government to do that. And it also opens up the possibility for them, or allows them, to go back and rescind TPS for other countries like Venezuela, where lower courts have said, nope, too dangerous, and they've blocked, right? Because this is part of a broader attack on TPS. We have seen the administration rescind TPS protections for a large number of countries. I'm going to talk about that in a second. So for women and girls, it's very dangerous because it makes them deportable to places where they may face extreme risk of violence and harm, right? In Syria, we work extensively with partners on the ground, and I'll actually direct you to our statement. I think somebody can drop it in the chat, where I talk about, that features the voice of one of our partners, Rasha Al-Dabshi, who has worked extensively on the dangers of, for women and girls in Syria right now, where they face sexual violence, they face extreme economic precarity, they face political violence. There, are very few structures that can support their urgent needs, including healthcare needs, right? And we're happy to connect you with her so you can learn more from, on the ground of what's happening.
Zain, and if I can, because I've just had a long conversation with Rasha, and she talks about the issue of citizenship rights. So the TPS for Syrians, this goes back, well, this is over a decade because we're going back to the Syrian war. And for women who have given birth to children in the US, those children don't have Syrian citizenship because it hasn't been passed through the mother. And so because of this gender discrimination in citizenship law, those children don't have the right to enter Syria. So we have these overlapping issues of gender discrimination. And we've got a live audience here at WRC in New York, including Catherine Harrington, who's sitting just behind my laptop view over here, who works with the global campaign for equal nationality rights. And so we see how these issues, you can see how these issues intersect across the globe in Syria, and then US policy, and then really putting women and their children in this bind.
Absolutely. And I think that is one. So, we're kind of facing layers of different kinds of harm that women and girls face, of course, depending on the country that they are returning to, right? And with the case of Syria, it's a really, really stark reminder that there are also other overlapping legal regimes that are present in many of the countries that have TPS, right? So in the case of Syrian women, as you noted, as Catherine works very, very closely on it, and we've worked closely together to highlight these issues in amicus briefs to the Supreme Court and in other spaces. Because Syrian women cannot pass citizenship to their children, if they are not married to a Syrian national, those children are effectively, stateless or cannot claim Syrian citizenship. And so if there's somebody in that situation who is a TPS holder in the United States, and if the mother is deported back to Syria, her children have no legal right to enter Syria, right? So they may be facing family separation. If they are returned to Syria and they are able to enter, they will be stateless or facing statelessness in Syria. This is an overlapping kind of really global protection crisis that we are forcing people into, right? And we see this in many, this is one specific issue, but I think we see these overlapping legal regimes where women and girls, when these protections are taken away, are being pushed back into danger. One that I really want to highlight is last July, we rescinded TPS for Afghanistan. Afghanistan is one of the most gender repressive regimes for women in the world. And women who were facing deportation to Afghanistan were unequivocal, saying that they faced certain death if they were removed to Afghanistan, right? So, they were very, very clear about the stakes. And we actually have a humanitarian futures fellow at WRC from Afghanistan who has spoken very eloquently on a lot of the dangers and issues around that women face in Afghanistan, and we work very closely on those issues. But, last July, we rescinded temporary protected status for Afghanistan and have been removing women to Afghanistan, both under that and deporting them, right? So the ways in which we are pushing women and girls back into these gender unequal and gender oppressive regimes without care and attention to that, kind of across the board is really, really concerning. And, TPS, Haiti and Syria is happening now, and we need immediate protections to protect Haitians and Syrians. But I also think we need to look at the broader TPS landscape and humanitarian protection landscape and make sure that we are protecting vulnerable populations, including women and girls, from being removed, deported to places where they're going to face this grave risk of harm.
Right. And as you mentioned, we're talking about 17 different countries. We're talking about a large population, a large group of people. And of course, these are people who are embedded in our communities. These are neighbors, these are people that we work with, these are people who are providing care, healthcare, contributing to the economy in really important ways. And so each country that is impacted is a different story, and the gender implications are different in each case. So again, I want to encourage our folks on the line who are working on these issues, where we can be helpful in breaking that down, in the ways in which the loss of these individuals is going to be felt in the United States, but also the particular gender impact. You talked about Haiti, you talked about Syria, you talked about Afghanistan. Can you name a couple of the other countries that still have people for whom we still have temporary protected status, but will be up for review?
Yeah, I mean the two that I'll highlight there. I mean, I can highlight three more countries. One that has already lost TPS status that we've done a lot of work on, and two that we're kind of facing, I think, an urgent potential crisis. So one is Lebanon. TPS status has been extended for Lebanon till November of 2026. We don't know what will happen after that. WRC has worked very closely with partners, and we have partners who are speaking, to the urgent crisis for women and girls, given the current conflict situation in Lebanon. And I think as that date approaches, we will want to continue to keep a very close eye, and we'll continue to update all of you on kind of what the situation for women and girls is if TPS holders from Lebanon are facing removal back to this incredibly unstable situation for women and girls. So that's one. The second that I want, oh, sorry, please go ahead, Xanthe.
No, go ahead, Zane.
Oh no, the second I was going to mention was Venezuela, which is now vulnerable. And that was one where lower courts had stepped in to say, no, you cannot do this because Venezuela is too dangerous. And now, of course, the administration can go back and ask a lower court to undo that, consistent with the Supreme Court ruling. And so that places, Venezuelans at quite heightened risk.
Yeah, so I think you just answered the next question that came in from the audience, which is, what does this decision mean for the future of how TPS would be administered? Which is basically the door is open to cancel TPS for these countries. I mean,
yeah. Basically, what the decision is doing, and again, I'm happy. Like I'm a nice legal academic policy wonk. So anyone who wants to know all of the details, I'm happy to go through, it point by point with you. But at a very kind of base level, like what it is saying is, it's saying courts cannot review these decisions, so the administration can rescind TPS essentially whenever it wants. What the main backstop that we have left is congressional protection, right? So Congress can step in and create protections. But basically, without those congressional protections that are really sort of firming or shoring up TPS protections and placing limits on when the administration can rescind TPS, right now, the administration kind of has carte blanche to rescind TPS at will. And so that's incredibly, incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, I think the thing that is really hitting home for me when you talk about these 17 countries, it is true with every single one of these countries that we have an extensive involvement with these countries. When we think about what's happening in Lebanon today, in Venezuela today, in Syria today, the extent to which the US has been involved, not just because we have these folks as a part of our community for so many years, but also because of foreign policy. And so it's going to be a very important story as we continue and go forward, and one where our community, but also just at large as a country, we have interest in these countries, we have interest in these individuals. So Zain, I'm going to bring back a question, I think, just to make sure this is clear. By the way, in the Q&A, we'd love to know your name and affiliation. You all are really vital, important members of our community. So feel free to share that if you would like. So this question just brings back the Syria point. Will the children of parents with TPS be allowed to return to Syria with their parents?
So I think this is really going to depend. And again, I would encourage anyone who wants to know more about exactly how this is going to function to reach out to Rasha, or to reach out to Catherine, who can connect you sort of with people on the ground who can help understand this in more detail. But it's really going to depend on whether or not they are eligible or they do have Syrian citizenship, right? So it basically, what these unequal nationality laws say is that a mother cannot pass citizenship to her children. So if she's married to a Syrian man, a U.S. Syrian citizen, that child will be, can claim Syrian citizenship, right? But that's not true of every person, right? True of every woman. So whether the child has a legal right to enter Syria or not, whether they're able to return with their parent or not, will sort of depend on whether or not they can claim citizenship through a Syrian father. But again, Rasha is the real expert. Definitely check out this legal atlas that the Global Campaign on Equal Nationality Rights has launched. It really, really helps break down how this works for, all 24 countries who have unequal nationality laws. And we're definitely happy to connect you with the real experts, which are the people, in Syria who understand how this is working on the ground.
So that's Rachel Tabshi with the WRC team. And we can go ahead and drop some contact information in the chat for Zain, for myself, for Sarah Massey, who's working with us on press relations, and we will make contact for you all there. Catherine Harrington just passed me a note in the room. She's saying that the children are frequently being able to enter, but they need to get visas, and this is a lengthy bureaucratic process. You can just imagine, for a person who's just been told that TPS can be canceled, the amount of chaos that these families are facing. But the decision would be at the discretion of the Syrian government. And this gets to a little bit of the broader work that we do at Women's Refugee Commission, and this global campaign, which focuses on the countries where women do not have the equal right to pass citizenship to their children. Catherine, it's 24 countries where that's the case, right? And so there's very, very active advocacy going on. And this is one of the issues within the domain of advocating for women and their families where we really can and do see positive change. And we've seen these laws change. And so, this is an issue on the US side. It's an issue on the Syrian side as well. Happy to talk more about that in detail. I've got a question in from, sorry, one more. Lebanon is one of them, Catherine is telling me. Lebanon is one of the countries where that is still an issue for women to pass citizenship. And this documentation issue is enormous. And this is something that we see, children who don't have birth certificates and don't have proper documentation cannot get access to basic services, cannot get access to education, to any kind of benefit programs, to health. And it puts them in an informal category in which really their fate is unclear. And I know this from my work with Freedom Fund, in which we do anti-trafficking work. It makes children vulnerable to trafficking. It makes children vulnerable to poverty, to illness, to all manner of compounding issues. And so the gray space issue that we're talking about, not having access to documentation or protracted, lengthy processes that make it difficult. There are so many implications of that. And we just heard earlier this week from Laura Valencia, who works with the global campaign for refugee youth, about how not having documentation can lead to delays in accessing education, for example. So it's just one of many, many different pieces. So I do have a question. I've got a couple questions coming in from the audience, so I'm going to try to move through these with the time that we have.
Sure.
I see that you have another thought, but I'm going to go to the question.
No, please. Yeah, please.
Dana Schilling. Thank you, Dana. Can a person facing deportation to a dangerous situation assert that deportation is a form of torture, essentially asserting the Convention Against Torture?
So the procedures under the Convention Against Torture are a little complicated. People can be eligible for withholding of removal, which is, basically a status that says, okay, we're not going to deport you. But that gives fewer kind of legal protections and status here and benefits here under the Convention Against Torture. Sort of short answer is both yes and no. It's complicated sometimes. But there's a very complicated kind of procedure for that. There's only certain times when you can do that under certain circumstances, and it would really, really, it would be extraordinarily variable. And that's not really, I think that the important thing to say is that is not concrete backstop protection at all, for what we're seeing or for what, risk we have here.
Right. All right, Judith from Public News Service. Thank you, Judith. Can you touch on any anecdotal evidence that points to why it's still dangerous to deport women and children to Venezuela and Syria, despite what the administration is currently asserting?
So for Syria, I think we can, this is where Russia and where some of the other partners that we work with on the ground can absolutely provide you with the concrete, it's not even just anecdotal, right? They have lived experience. They work in these issues on the ground. They are the real experts. We are delighted to connect you with them, Judith, and make sure that you can speak with them directly. Actually, our statement too contains a really compelling quote by Russia, which sort of just, again, it's, 5 lines. So it's just kind of highlighting the top lines of these dangers, but really sort of demonstrates, I think, why it is specifically dangerous. And we're happy to connect you with her.
She talks about violence against ethnic and minority groups in Syria in particular in that statement. So there are documented instances there.
Exactly.
And certainly the news, this tragic news out of Venezuela has us thinking about the vulnerabilities in a community environment that has faced so many challenges. Rasha's quote, thank you. Forcing Syrian women to return means sending them back to ruins without housing or any economic empowerment programs to protect them. She talks about mothers whose children hold other nationalities that face harsh financial and psychological challenges because their children are essentially viewed as foreigners. And then she goes on to say, the Supreme Court's decision ignores a bitter reality. Syria cannot be deemed safe just because the Assad regime fell, as the country is navigating a critical transition amid total economic collapse. And what is terrifying is the imminent threat faced by minorities, particularly Alawite and Druze women, given the surge in human rights violations and documented kidnappings over the past year. She continues, so happy to share more there.
Judith, one additional kind of answer or piece of context that I would give you, or something that you can think about, is actually the situation in Honduras. And we lost TPS. The United States rescinded TPS for Honduras last year. And WRC has done extensive work in Honduras. Both, we've got the report in the chat that talks when we talked about family separation. We did that by going down to Honduras and speaking with deported parents, women, pregnant women, mothers, as soon as they were coming off the plane, to document their experiences of family separation and collect that evidence. We have also done work on the lived experience around gender and sexual-based violence in Honduras for Honduran women. So this would include women who are removed, but also the context in Honduras, especially with the loss of USAID funding and how that's really bankrupted access to services. And Honduras is already an incredibly dangerous place for women. It has one of the highest rates of femicide in the Western Hemisphere, right? And we've kind of really, with the loss of USAID, really bankrupted a lot of the services that would protect women. And it was in that context, that we rescinded TPS for Honduras and have been deporting, we've deported approximately 40,000 Honduran nationals back to Honduras in 2025 alone. And so I think, if you take a look at that report, it'll provide a lot of really concrete evidence that demonstrates why Honduras is so dangerous. And I'm happy to talk further about that with you offline.
Yeah, thank you. And I think with regards to Venezuela and Syria, that these are not stories that we're seeing. We're not seeing the stories because press is really consumed with what's happening inside the United States. And so for those reporters with an international purview, it's just so important. And thank you for asking and for following these questions so that we can have a better understanding of what is happening inside Syria. There was a time when Syria was front page news. And unfortunately, attention is short. So we do need to pull back to understand what the reality is on the ground in Venezuela and Syria and this range of countries. So Zain, this is a part of the call where we talk about action. We know that there are very, very many problems. I think what I really appreciate about understanding your work is that there are inroads, there are things that can be done, there are things that are being done. And I know that is why many people have joined this call, so that they can join on, inform their own actions, amplify. Tell us about some of the concrete activities that you're involved in to advance issues related to better protections, both for, that cross all of these rulings and the different issues that we've touched on.
Absolutely. So the answer, at the base answer that answered your question that you really said, Xanthe, and I just want to sort of pull that up, is yes, there are solutions. There are things we can do that are very concrete that we are doing, not just WRC, but across the advocacy community and with our partners. So, the first, and I think this is something that applies to, all of the three decisions, is congressional action. And we work very closely with lawmakers, to make sure that protections are put in place to mitigate the harms of what, everything that we've talked about today. So TPS, there are two very specific bills on the floor, one on the House, one on the Senate. We'll get you the information, in a follow-up email, so you don't have to be writing down bill numbers, in this conversation. But, that would protect access to TPS or protect TPS for Haitians and Syrians. And we need that now because this is a population that is facing removal today, but we also need broader TPS protections, right? We need Congress to pass protections that are broader than just this particular population, because as we talked about, this is a broader sort of attack on those humanitarian protections, and it's forcing women and girls back into danger. See conversation about, everything that we've discussed, right? And, especially leading up to, say, for instance, the rescission or potential rescission of TPS for Lebanon Lebanon in November, right? So we really need to be looking much more broadly than just what these two bills are doing. So we are working with members of Congress on these two bills. We strongly support them, but also working to try to expand those protections to make sure that women and girls are protected and are not deported back to places where they'll face grave violence and harm. Same with asylum. We talked about, with the asylum decision, we talked about Congress needing to step in and put guardrails around that. And, WRC, the Migrant Rights and Justice Project, has played a leading role on protecting access to asylum and, ensuring fair, equitable, and safe protections for migrant women and girls who urgently need these protections for decades. And we will continue to do that. And we're continuing to do that work to ensure that there are guardrails, that any metering policy is safe, is, fair, is equitable, and pays attention to these safety concerns. So working very hard on those issues as well. And with birthright citizenship, we are one of the leading, or some of the issues that we talked about with birthright citizenship. We work extremely closely with partners, with policymakers, with lawmakers, both in the United States, at the international level, and, in receiving countries like Honduras, to create protections around preventing family separation, ensuring that parents have the ability to make choices about what happens to their children, and on reunification systems, right? So we work on all sides of this issue, really at all levels. And one piece of legislation that I really want to mention or flag that's directly relevant to what we talked about today is something called the Help Separated Children Act, which we worked on very closely in advance. It was introduced by Senator Smith and Senator Cortez Masto, and it would codify a lot of these protections so that parents would have the opportunity, among many other, rights that they would have, but they would have a legal right to be able to make decisions about what happens to their children if they are removed, to create and the space and time and resources that they need to get their child a legal guardian or to make arrangements to bring their child with them when they're deported. And you can support that legislation, and we will provide that to you as well.
Right. And you worked on an amicus brief as well around birthright citizenship.
Yes. We worked on an amicus brief around birthright citizenship that we filed. We actually filed two, one at the circuit court level and then one at the Supreme Court level. Catherine, who you've heard from many times through Xanthe, actually worked on that together. And that really highlighted the dangers of unequal nationality rights. For if birthright citizenship were to be revoked, what would happen? The issue is not just statelessness, but the risk of permanent statelessness for children who, cannot claim citizenship through their mother. And that was sort of an additional, piece of information that we thought was incredibly important. And we worked closely with other groups to contribute to, contribute this joint expertise to two amicus briefs on that issue.
So when I woke up this morning and looked at the front of the New York Times, it talked about how close the ruling was on birthright citizenship. And I think that the fact that birthright citizenship was affirmed and that these amicus briefs went to the court and that advocacy was organized and based in research, I think that sends a very powerful signal to our community of how vital all of this work is. We are in the midst of a transformation of the legal and policy regime that affects refugees and immigrants, and some of this comes down to very narrow decisions. So it is really incumbent on us as a community to bring and pull up the voices, research, and solutions of women on the front lines. Unfortunately, in this conversation, many of the women that we talk to, we are not naming by name, given the dangers that people face and the various realities that people are navigating. But that's our role, and I think that's the role of those on the line. I think we can go ahead and wrap here, knowing that this is a continuing conversation. For those of you who I haven't met, I'm the very new CEO and president of Women's Refugee Commission. I'm really honored to be able to facilitate this conversation. And also going forward, we want to hear much more from you. We want to be in very direct contact. We're very happy to be responsive to your needs and interests in these types of calls, and to your suggestions about women that we need to platform and highlight who are doing research, in particular research and policy work, which is our mandate, but also women on the front lines of these issues. So please be in touch with us. You will be hearing from us. We want your feedback as well. How can this be more informative for you going forward? We'll look forward to seeing you next time, and thank you for your work on these issues. Thank you, Zain.
Thank you very much, Xanthe, and thank you to everyone here. We look forward to continuing the conversation.
All right, thank you. Bye.